The cold wind swept through the busy streets of New York City as the sun dipped below the skyline. The neon lights of high-end boutiques and luxury hotels flickered against the glass buildings, illuminating the bustling sidewalks. It was a city that never slept, a place where wealth and struggle coexisted on the same streets, but rarely crossed paths. Outside the Regency Grand Hotel, a doorman in a crisp black uniform held the entrance open as elegantly dressed guests stepped out onto the sidewalk. A few feet away, a much different scene was unfolding. A man in his late 50s, wearing an old, worn-out military jacket, sat on the pavement near the hotel entrance. His boots were torn, his hands rough and calloused. Beside him, a small sign read, "U.S. Veteran, Hungry. Please help." The hotel's security guard, a large man in a navy blue jacket, stood over him, his expression cold. "I already told you," the guard snapped. "You can't sit here. Move along." The veteran lifted his gaze, his tired eyes filled with quiet dignity. "Just need a minute," he muttered. "It's freezing out." The security guard sighed impatiently. "This is private property. You're making the guests uncomfortable." If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on the choices in your own life. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories. Just as the guard reached down to grab the veteran's arm, a deep, familiar voice cut through the air. "That won't be necessary." The security guard turned around, startled. Standing a few feet away, dressed in a long dark coat and a scarf, his hands tucked into his pockets, was one other than Morgan Freeman. His expression was calm, but his eyes were piercing. The entire sidewalk seemed to pause. The sidewalk grew eerily silent. A few people had already started watching, but now, with Morgan Freeman standing there, the atmosphere shifted completely. The security guard, caught off guard, hesitated before clearing his throat. "Sir, this is a private establishment. We don't allow loitering." Morgan took a slow step forward, his rich, commanding voice steady but firm. "Loitering," he echoed. "This man is a veteran, a man who served his country. And now, when he needs kindness the most, he's being treated like a nuisance." The security guard stiffened. "I'm just following policy, Mr. Freeman." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "I understand rules," he said, nodding slightly. "But sometimes, rules are just excuses for ignoring what's right." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A woman in a long red coat whispered to her companion. A businessman checked his watch but didn't walk away, and even the hotel's doorman subtly leaned closer to listen. The veteran, still sitting on the ground, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to people speaking up for him. The security guard sighed, clearly uncomfortable. But before he could speak, Morgan crouched down next to the veteran. "What's your name, soldier?" The man looked at him for a moment, hesitant, then finally said, "Daniel." Morgan gave him a small nod. "All right, Daniel, let's get you something warm to eat." The security guard opened his mouth to object, but Morgan simply stood up, offering Daniel a hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that held the weight of something much bigger. Daniel stared at Morgan's hand for a second, as if unsure whether this was real. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. As Morgan helped him to his feet, a ripple of something unspoken moved through the crowd: respect. Sakuti situation had changed. Morgan Freeman had turned a moment of dismissal into one of dignity. Morgan and Daniel walked side by side down the sidewalk, leaving the stunned security guard behind. No one tried to stop them. A few curious onlookers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. A few blocks away, Morgan led Daniel into a small 24-hour diner. The warm air wrapped around them like a blanket, and the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the space. Outside, the city buzzed, but in here, time seemed to slow down. A waitress in a pink uniform approached with a tired but friendly smile. "Take any seat you'd like, honey," she said, handing them menus. Her gaze lingered on Daniel's worn military jacket, her smile softening. They settled into a booth by the window. The laminated menu sat untouched in front of Daniel. His fingers traced its edges, as if he wasn't sure what to do with it. He hesitated. "You really don't have to do this." Morgan shook his head. "It's not about what I have to do, Daniel. It's about what I should do." For the first time that night, Daniel allowed himself to relax. His shoulders eased slightly, his posture less rigid. He looked around, as if reminding himself what it felt like to be in a warm place where he wasn't being told to leave. The waitress returned, pen poised over her notepad. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" Daniel hesitated, fingers brushing the table. His voice was quiet. I don't want to be a bother," Morgan noticed. "Order whatever you want," he encouraged, his tone gentle but firm. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking. Just a burger and coffee." The waitress gave him a warm smile. "That's all? You sure?" Daniel nodded, as if even asking for that much was difficult. As she walked away, Morgan leaned back in his seat, studying Daniel carefully. "So, tell me, what happened?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. And finally, he began to speak. The diner buzzed with quiet conversations, the occasional clatter of dishes breaking the silence. Daniel sat across from Morgan, his fingers wrapped around the steaming cup of coffee. Morgan watched him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to." Daniel let out a slow breath. Then he finally spoke. "I was in the Army. 12 years. 2 tours." Morgan nodded. "Combat engineer?" Daniel gave a hollow chuckle. "And demolition expert." His fingers tapped against the ceramic cup. "I came back thinking I'd have time to figure things out. But life doesn't wait." His voice was steady, but there was weight behind it. "My wife, she tried to hold everything together, but money got tight. I lost my job, then my home, and then everything unraveled." The words hung in the air. Morgan didn't interrupt. He just listened. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "I used to think things like this didn't happen to people like me." Morgan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're still here, Daniel. That means something." Daniel looked down at his cup. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't just looking at him. Someone was seeing him. A moment of silence passed. Morgan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a black card. He placed it on the table. "That's a number for someone who can help. No charity, just a real chance." Daniel hesitated, staring at the card. "What is this?" Morgan leaned back. "A job lead, a veterans program, a way back." Daniel blinked. No one had ever offered him a way back. Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked up the card. Morgan stood up, slipping his coat back on. "It's your choice, but I hope you call." Daniel looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" Morgan smiled faintly. "Because someone once did it for me." Daniel's eyes burned, but he nodded. As Morgan walked out into the night, Daniel sat there, still holding the card. For the first time in years, he had something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. If you had the power to change someone's life, would you do it? Tell us in the comments. And if this story inspired you, Subscribe now, because tomorrow we have another powerful story waiting for you.